policymakers sort of know this, but they don't really fully know this. They think about housing in the terms of, well, we have a housing crisis and we need more housing. And I mean, we do need more housing, but we also need to put the housing in the right place. Otherwise, we're just creating more transport crisis. Accessibility is a real thing. How many things can I reach at a given time by a given mode?
David, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast to chat with me today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So, I always like to start off by asking people to do a bit of like a 30-second elevator pitch about themselves. So, are you able to introduce yourself, your name, your title, and the organization that you're with?
Sure. I am David Levinson. I'm a professor of transportation engineering in the Faculty of Engineering at the University of Sydney, and I direct the Transport Lab Research Group.
So, you are also associated with the Institute of Transport and Logistics Studies, or ITLS for short. How are you involved with the Institute, and what do you think makes the Institute unique?
Before I came to Sydney, I was on the International Advisory Board or something like that. David Hensher periodically consulted with, more just sort of told us what he was doing, and we would nod our heads. But if one of us was in Sydney, then I guess they would meet at the advisory board. And since I came to Sydney, I'm on the advisory board. And at, the idea of that is to provide advice and support to ITLS. Now, as a member of the university, I'm in a different position than almost everybody else on the advisory board in that I'm also an academic and I do research with some of the members of ITLS. And so I'm currently on a project with Michael Bell as well as Muslim Ramazani in the Faculty of Engineering, where we're looking at how do we design autonomous vehicles in a way that's socially beneficial. So the algorithms for AVs now are basically make sure the AV doesn't crash and moves the passengers forward in traffic, which are good things to do. But it doesn't really care about whether its behavior is causing congestion for other vehicles on the road. And so can we think about ways of making that more optimal, or how do we consider how AVs move around pedestrians? So those kinds of questions, and building simulation models of that and algorithms to deal with that. And we've actually built a small reduced scale mobile robot lab in the basement of our building where we have small robots going around interacting as if they're AVs. So you could say, well, it'd be great to be able to do this with full size cars, and that would be true.
So, you're telling me there's no budget for like a Tesla or.
Yeah, I believe we've requested a driverless car at one point and not get that funded. Um, but yeah, the small robots are much less expensive. I mean, you're basically comparing a $2,000 vehicle with a $50,000, $100,000 vehicle. It's good to test this stuff in the laboratory context at least first. So have that project going on. We have a bunch of students going through and meet with others and talk with them about various things.
Yeah, yeah. Something else that you've written quite extensively about is the relationship between transport and land use, which I can imagine probably also has an interesting slant to it when you also combine automation. But I digress slightly. So, in your view, what do you think is the most under or misunderstood aspect of the relationship between transport and land use amongst policymakers?
I think it's the assumption that transport and land use are separate, inseparable problems. They're the same thing, really. And so the question that we're looking for is why does anybody locate anywhere? And the reason anybody locates anywhere at any time is because they want to be able to engage in some activity or be closer to some future things, some opportunities that they want to deal with, or to be far from things. They want to be out in the country as far away from other people as possible. So it's about how close you are to something or how far you are from something, but basically the same thing. It's just the thing is just put a negative sign in front of the thing. We can achieve that by putting things closer to people that they want to be near, or we can allow them to move faster on the network, right? So there's a proximity solution about how you organize land use and a network solution about how direct and fast the network is. And we need to deal with both of those things. Now, there are sub problems there. Like you say, okay, I'm managing a freeway. I don't control land use, or I'm a zoning administrator. I don't control the transport network. And in the short run, that's true. But if we're thinking about the long run, we need to be thinking about both of these things simultaneously. And especially as we're laying out new areas of a metropolitan area, but also as we're trying to retrofit the city. And we think about, well, where are the jobs now and where do people live now? And then they're not in the same place. And that's why we have a lot of commuting. And if they were in the same place, we'd have a lot less commuting. Adding population and adding employment while reducing the amount of travel if we put things in the right place. Policymakers sort of know this, but they don't really fully know this. They think about housing in the terms of, well, we have a housing crisis and we need more housing. And I mean, we do need more housing, but we also need to put the housing in the right place. Otherwise, we're just creating more transport crisis. And that's not a good way to manage. So we need to be putting more housing in the eastern part of the city in particular. And obviously that's got political challenges. Otherwise, this would have already happened. But otherwise, you're stuck building multi-billion-dollar motorway systems and rail systems and so on to serve the masses of people that you want to move across the city so they can be in the eastern part of the city part of the day, but not the whole day. And, there's class issues. There's all sorts of sociological issues that explain this.
One of the problems that does come up quite a lot or is an undertone in this conversation is the idea of accessibility. And I think it's quite a broad term that a lot of people talk about, but no one really defines what that means. So are you able to actually talk about
Yeah.
what is accessibility?
Yeah. We've defined it. We've spent lots of papers defining it, right? And we've done two review papers which summarized and synthesized how other people have defined it, right? So one of them was like doing sort of family tree of all the accessibility measures. And the basic idea, the simplest way of explaining it to people is if we want to measure access to jobs, how many jobs can you reach in a given amount of time? So how many jobs can you reach in 30 minutes of travel at 8 a.m. by public transit? And you get a number. And there's a number you could go out and count and you can validate it. It's a real thing. It's not some abstract denominator of a choice model that's in a strategic transport planning model that nobody really understands and has no physical meaning. Accessibility is a real thing. How many things can I reach at a given time by a given mode? And, we can measure that. We can measure that for how many jobs you can reach in 60 minutes. We can measure it for all the different modes. But I think that we should be looking at that kind of question. How many jobs can you reach and can you reach? And you can look at other destinations besides jobs, but jobs is typically the dominant feature of it. And since it's so concentrated in time, morning rush hour or evening rush hour, that it puts the greatest stresses on the system. Measuring that's important. And then we want to say, well, will this policy decision make this number better or worse? And for whom? Probably the best recent example of that is what happened with WestConnex, which made it much easier for people in Western Sydney to get into the CBD, but made it harder for people on the Balmain Peninsula to get to the CBD. Okay, that's a policy choice. It was a trade-off. But in the end, the Anzac Bridge wasn't going to get any wider. So it was a question of who got to the front of the queue first. And then it's just a question of organizing who gets access to that scarce resource, the bottleneck, the Anzac Bridge. Because even if you made the Anzac Bridge wider, you're going to make the streets in the city of Sydney wider? No. So where are all those cars going to go?
It is very hard to separate the policy and the politics sometimes. On back onto the access kind of conversation. So in your book, you actually wrote a book about the end of traffic and the future of access, and you suggested that access is actually eclipsing mobility as this primary goal of transport. Can you explain what that shift away from mobility and towards access means in practice?
So mobility is a measure of how fast you can move on the network. And all other things being equal, which they never are, but if all other things are equal, you want to be able to move faster rather than slower, generally because the objective is to be able to do things beyond traveling rather than just traveling. And accessibility is about how many things you can reach. You choose where to live based on the opportunities that'll be available to you, and you weight the opportunities you care about more than the ones you don't care about. The market makes a decision how that affects the price of land, and we see that places that have more accessibility, that are closer to the center of the region, generally are valued more highly. And every conversation in Sydney is about real estate, which means every conversation in Sydney is about accessibility. The places of the highest accessibility are where you'd think they are overall. I mean, the CBD. And what we're trying to do is design a system not that allows you to move fast on the network, but that allows you to reach places you want to go. And how do we know that? Well, the example that I always like to pull out is look at Manhattan. The streets in Manhattan are not very fast, okay, but people can reach a lot of activities. And you compare it to, I think the example we used in the book was Manitoba, prairie province in Canada, where you can move very fast on the roads in Manitoba, but you're not getting very, very far really because you're not able to reach anything, right? So you're moving quickly to areas where there's just more wheat fields. That's the nature of how the economy works. And that's how we know people care about access, not mobility. Now, if your job is to manage a highway, you want to manage that highway effectively. And so you're concerned about that. But you want to make sure that that's a sub-level problem. We want to make sure that there's an overarching view which says that that's not the dominant problem, right? So on the short run, yeah, we want to make sure the network operates faster, but how do we make the network effective simultaneously with recognizing the upper level decision? We can think of it in another example, traffic signal timings. Okay, so we only let one type of traffic through, either cars or pedestrians at a time, across a given space. But you can make it so that pedestrians have more time to cross, which means that pedestrians will have less delay. Or you can make it so that vehicles have more time to cross, which means that pedestrians will have more delay. If pedestrians have more delay, pedestrians can't get as far in the same amount of time. So you're reducing pedestrian access quite significantly. And you're doing that for the benefit of drivers. But we haven't really implemented a system to prioritize pedestrians. And not only are we reducing pedestrian access, we're changing whether people are choosing to be pedestrians at all. I mean, I've got a choice to walk, let's say, 1.5 kilometers. And if it takes me, I don't know, 20 minutes or 30 minutes, well, if it takes me 20 minutes, then I might walk it. And if it takes me 30 minutes and I have a car available and the traffic signals are timed to benefit cars, and it'll take me 5 minutes to drive, then maybe I'll drive. And then we get more people driving, which changes how you weight traffic signal timings because there's more cars. So we want to give more time to cars. So it's a policy decision about how you're using the transport network and in this case, whose accessibility is being prioritized.
Do you think the public understanding of access has changed, or do you think there's still a lot that either is lost in translation or that maybe people implicitly understand but maybe don't explicitly talk about?
The public understands accessibility in that they understand real estate. So they sort of understand it. Now, if you were to ask the public, how many jobs do you think you can reach in 30 minutes? Their answers are not very accurate. And we've done this, and their answers are not very accurate. And their answer is better for the modes they use than for the modes they don't use. So they generally overestimate the travel times on the modes that they don't use. So they think walking is slower and they take transit is slower than it actually is if they drive, and vice versa. There are planners who don't understand this properly in an analytical way, right? So there's a lot of, if you look at reports put out by Transport for New South Wales and other organizations, they use something called the PTAL index, or public transit accessibility levels. It came out of London in the 1990s. And it might have been, it wasn't, but it might have been the best they could do with geographic information systems in the early 1990s. And it's basically how far are you from the nearest transit stop? And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with knowing that. But it's not the question, because unless you work at that transit stop or you want to get coffee at that transit stop, what you're actually interested in as to where you can go to from that transit stop. So we're really interested in access to the destinations, jobs, entertainment venues, shops, wherever, rather than access to the transit node itself. And we have the technology to measure this. We've had the technology to measure this for a long time. We have the ability to map it, and I think we have the ability to explain it to policymakers. but the planners aren't picking up on this. And so you see, I don't know how much it's they don't understand it versus they feel the need to dumb it down for the public or the policymakers. But it's a self-fulfilling prophecy if you never make them think about a more advanced way of doing the analysis. Then how long does it take me to get to the nearest transit stop, as if the time on the vehicle doesn't matter. They're never going to think beyond that. They're going to misunderstand the problem. The word is going to mean something different than it should mean. And I think we should be spending the time to teach them about how long does it take them to get to the destinations they care about. And I don't think that's too hard for many policymakers. And I don't say all of them, but many policymakers can understand that. And then say, well, the policymakers are smart and they understand it, but the public won't understand it. And the public will understand it if you spend a little bit of time trying to explain it to them. This can be explained, and it's important that it's explained. Otherwise, you wind up optimizing the wrong variable, right? So if all you think about is mobility, then you optimize road level of service, and then you try to make the road network faster. But in the end, you tell people you're going to make the road faster, and they're going to say, okay, you're either going to make it straighter or you're going to make it wider. And there's a lot of reasons that in built up areas, we don't want to do either of those things. So we need to teach them that accessibility is the problem and that we can improve accessibility by how we design the system, but also how we move in the transport system, but also how we place future activities. And so that we build more housing in the eastern part of Sydney and more jobs in the western part of Sydney.
Going back to, you mentioned kind of two things. You talked about proximity and you talked about speed through a network. And in your work, you've championed a lot the idea of the 30-minute city, which I think a lot of people are familiar with. That's kind of in